I want to be honest with you about something I do not often say directly on this channel. The year after Robert passed was the hardest year of my adult life, and it was not hard only because of the grief. It was hard because nobody had told me about any of the specific things I am going to describe today, and I arrived at each of them entirely unprepared, with no language for what I was experiencing, and no frame of reference for whether what I was going through was simply what widowhood is, or something that was going wrong with me specifically. Those two possibilities feel very different from the inside, and not knowing which one is true makes everything harder. I was 63 when Robert died, not 70, so the title of this video is not a perfect match for my own biography. But what I am going to describe, I have observed across a range of women widowed in their 60s and 70s, and the things that surprised me surprised nearly all of them as well. What these 8 things have in common is this: nobody mentioned them beforehand. Not the people around me in the first weeks, not the general conversations about grief I had been part of over the years, not the practical guidance that arrives when someone close to you dies. The specific and unglamorous things about becoming a widow at this stage of life, the things you encounter on an ordinary Tuesday 6 months in rather than in the immediate aftermath, those things nobody names. I am going to name them. Leave a comment below as we go if any of this reflects your experience, whether from the inside or from watching someone close to you navigate this. I find that the most useful conversations on this subject tend to involve the specific and the honest, rather than the general and the reassuring. The first thing nobody prepares you for is how much of your daily sense of yourself was constructed around being part of a pair. Not in a sentimental way, and not in a dependent way necessarily, simply in the ordinary, practical way that years of living with another person arranges you. You become the person who does certain things because the other person does other things. You refer to yourself as we in contexts you no longer notice. You make decisions inside the implicit framework of another person's preferences and schedule, so automatically and for so long that you have stopped experiencing them as decisions at all. When that person is gone, the decisions surface, all of them, at once. And there is a particular disorientation in discovering, at this stage of life, that you have preferences you have never been asked to name. I remember several months after Robert passed, standing in the grocery store deciding what to buy for dinner, and feeling a specific kind of paralysis that I could not at first account for. I had been cooking for decades. I knew how to cook. What I had lost was the implicit framework of another person's tastes that had been quietly organizing my choices for so long that I had not known it was there. The disorientation was not about grief in any clean sense. It was about identity, the specific and unannounced work of becoming a singular person again after many years of being a particular kind of plural. Nobody had mentioned that this work existed, let alone that it took as long as it does. The second thing is the paperwork. I am not sure why nobody discusses this more directly, because it is one of the most concrete and time-consuming features of the months following a death, and it arrives at exactly the moment when you have the least capacity for it. Accounts to close or transfer, legal documents to file, insurance claims to submit. Every institution that knew your husband requires notification, and most require documentation, and many require multiple phone calls with people who speak to you in formal and efficient language, while you are anything but formal and efficient. Some of it is urgent. Some of it drags on for months. None of it takes the shape of grief. It is administrative and specific and relentless, and it requires a version of you that is organized and persistent and clear at the exact time when you are none of those things. I want to say something practical about this because I think it is more useful than sympathy. If you have a friend or neighbor who is newly widowed, one of the most genuinely useful things you can do in the weeks after the immediate crisis has passed is to offer to sit with her while she works through the administrative tasks. Not to take them over, just to be present while she does them, to help her keep track of what has been addressed and what still needs addressing, to make the phone calls less solitary. This is not the dramatic form of support, but it is the form most needed and least often offered. The third thing is the way the house sounds. This is harder to describe because it is not precisely about noise. What I mean, and what nearly every widow I have spoken to describes in her own way, is that the silence after a death is not simply an absence. It is a presence. Something has moved in and occupies specific space. The quality of certain rooms changes. The evening is different. The morning, which used to arrive with the ambient texture of another person beginning their day somewhere in the house, now arrives without that texture, and the arrival without texture is not peaceful. It is simply a different kind of room. I lived with this for longer than I expected, and what I eventually came to understand is that the house was not actually quieter. The house contained the same ambient sounds it always had. What had changed was that I was no longer supplying the specific form of presence that exists between two people who are paying quiet and ongoing attention to each other, which is a constant and largely unconscious sound that only becomes perceptible in its absence. Finding a new relationship with the sound of a house that contains only you takes time that nobody warns you about. And in the meantime, the house can feel like a different building than the one you knew. If you enjoy this channel and want to support my work, just look directly below the video player, right next to the subscribe button, and click the button that says Join. That is how you become a Smart Organizer. Smart Organizers members get exclusive videos, a loyalty badge in the comments, and custom channel emojis. I would love to have you there. The fourth thing is what happens to certain friendships. Specifically, the friendships that were organized around the two of you as a couple. Other pairs who socialized with you as a unit, who thought of the invitation as going to both of you, whose friendship was as much with the marriage as with either person individually. What tends to happen to those friendships, gradually and without anyone meaning harm, is that they become more occasional, and then less frequent, and then quiet. The invitations come less reliably. The dinners that used to be for 8 become dinners for 6, without the seat being empty exactly, just without the call that would fill it. Nobody intends this. It is simply that the social arrangement that was invited no longer exists in the form that was invited. I understood this intellectually before it happened, and was still caught off guard when it did, which tells me something about the distance between knowing something and experiencing it. What I want to say about it is not that the people who drifted away were unkind, because most of them were not. I want to say that it is useful to be prepared for it, rather than to arrive at it on a specific quiet Saturday with no expectation, and that the women who navigate this particular adjustment most gracefully tend to be the ones who were already building friendships of their own that did not depend on the structure of the couple. The fifth thing is that grief lives in the body. I do not mean this dramatically. I mean it in the specific and practical way that a woman who did not expect it is likely to encounter. The exhaustion that arrives not from doing too much, but from simply existing while carrying a significant weight, which requires considerable energy without producing anything you can point to. The appetite that changes in ways you did not choose. The sleep that becomes unreliable. The specific physical heaviness of certain mornings that has nothing to do with whether you are physically unwell. These things I had heard described in general terms before I experienced them, and I had not quite believed them. When they arrived, I spent several weeks wondering whether something was medically wrong with me, before I came to understand that what my body was doing was a reasonable and ordinary response to an extraordinary loss. What I want to say to any woman currently in the early part of this is the thing I most needed to hear and did not hear until later than it would have been useful. The physical dimension of what you are going through is real. It is not a sign that something is going wrong, and it will shift. It shifts slowly, but it does shift, and knowing that it is normal rather than a sign of failure makes it considerably more bearable. The body is not dramatizing. It is doing what bodies do when the life they were arranged around changes fundamentally. Leave a comment below if any of the first 5 things I have described reflect your experience, even from a distance. I think widowhood is one of the subjects that benefits most from being discussed honestly, and the comments on videos like this one tend to contain the most useful forms of honesty. The 6th thing is how long it actually takes. People mentioned a year or 2 to me in the early period, and I heard this as a long time. What I understand now, looking back across 9 years, is that what people meant by a year or two was not that the grief would be resolved, but that the most acute phase of it would begin to lift enough to allow other things to exist alongside it. The grief itself has a longer arc than that, and it does not follow a straight line. And there are years when it is almost absent, and then something happens, a season, a piece of music, a specific quality of afternoon light, and it is completely present again in a way that surprises you even after the years have passed. There is also the guilt of beginning to feel better, which I want to name directly because I think it is one of the least discussed and most universal features of grief. The guilt of noticing, at some point several months or a year in, that you have had a full afternoon that was not marked by the loss. The guilt of finding something genuinely funny. The guilt of being pleased by something ordinary, a meal you made, a piece of work you finished, the garden in a particular light. What I know now that I did not know then is that returning to yourself is not a betrayal of the person you lost. It is simply what living requires, and it takes as long as it takes, and the length of time it takes is not a measure of how much you loved. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, I would love to have you here. I post regularly on topics like this one, and the subscribe button is just below. The seventh thing is the one I think women feel most reluctant to say, and I am going to say it plainly because I believe it is worth naming. At some point in the first year or two, most widows I have spoken honestly with describe at least one moment of something that felt uncomfortably like relief, or like freedom, or like a specific quality of autonomy that they had not expected. Not relief that the person is gone, not indifference to the loss, but a particular awareness of a freedom of movement and daily arrangement and decision that had been constrained, in ways invisible while they existed, by the shared life. I felt this. It arrived without warning and was accompanied immediately by a quality of shame that I think is the most common response to it. The shame is not warranted. What arrives in that moment is not evidence of insufficient love. It is information about yourself and your life that the structure of the shared existence had kept in the background, available only now that the structure has changed. It is real information and it is useful, and the women who allow themselves to receive it without pushing it away tend, in my observation, to come to a more honest and more integrated relationship with their grief than the women who do not. What you are feeling is not a betrayal. It is part of the truth of what a life contains. The eighth thing, and the one I find most unexpectedly worth describing, is what you discover about yourself. Widowhood, for all its genuine difficulty and all its real loss, has a quality of revelation that I did not anticipate and that I have heard described in their own words and with some surprise by most of the women I know who have been through it honestly. You discover what you are capable of, not in an abstract or inspirational sense, but in the specific and practical sense of encountering, one task at a time, that you can do things you did not know you could do, manage things you had not managed before, live in ways you had not imagined because you had never been required to. I managed the finances entirely on my own for the first time in my adult life and found that I was competent. I made decisions about the house and about my time and about which relationships deserved my continued investment, decisions that had previously been made jointly or by default, and I found that I had clear preferences I had not fully examined. I became someone who could sit alone in a house in the evening and be genuinely all right, not always comfortable, not always at peace, but all right in a way that I now understand as a specific and hard-earned quality of knowing yourself that the shared life, for all its genuine value, had not had occasion to develop in me. That quality is mine now in a way it was not before. I did not ask for the way it arrived, but I would not give it back. What I want to close with is this. The 8 things I have described are not reasons to dread widowhood or to arm yourself against it in advance. They are simply what it contains that nobody tends to say out loud. And the reason I think it is worth saying them is that women who are prepared for what they will actually encounter tend to navigate it with more steadiness and more self-trust than women who arrive at each thing with no expectation at all. The grief is real, the difficulty is real, and so is the discovery. All three of these things are true at the same time, and none of them cancels the others out. Tell me in the comments which of these 8 things reflects something you have lived, and whether there is something that belongs on this list that I did not name. I believe these conversations are among the most useful ones this channel can have, and I read every word of what you share. And if this is your first time here, I would be glad to have you subscribe. I will see you in the next one.